What is the surprising thing that I learned from doing 5.5 years of occupational therapy with my PDA son, Cooper, who is now 10? So as you're listening to this, you might be thinking, oh, Casey's going to talk about interoception or sensory differences or sensory integration. But really the most surprising thing that I have learned from these 5.5 years with my son in occupational therapy is how to navigate loss. Okay, so today I want to talk about that theme with you and tell a story in order to illustrate this concept. Okay, so 5.5 years ago, a little more than that, I left my job at a large research nonprofit in Washington, D.C., and my PDA son was in burnout and in crisis. And one of the first things we did was to dive into occupational therapy because we were still thinking of his challenges through the sensory processing disorder lens, not PDA and the survival drive for autonomy. And so I remember that I had just stopped with my career, and this was a very intense career, right? I would already be on the metro at 7:45, so I could be at my desk, and I would be there in an office, and had to be professional, wear heels, wear pearls, all the things. Okay, so all of a sudden I had left behind this part of my identity as a professional with a PhD in Washington, D.C., and I was walking into something that I knew absolutely nothing about, right? I had never even heard of sensory processing disorder, neurodiversity, or anything of the sort. Okay, so the first day of occupational therapy, when we finally found a practice that I thought would be a good fit, it was a repurposed large garage attached to someone's house, and it had all of these hammock swings and crash pads and things you could climb on. And my son walked in and was sort of having a freeze response, right? Like he didn't speak to the therapist. He didn't want to take off his shoes. He didn't want to walk. He didn't want to move. Eventually, he gravitated towards this large hammock swing and got in the hammock swing. And she started moving him back and forth like he was in a womb that was swinging. And my husband and I used to say, Cooper has been uncomfortable since the moment he left your womb, okay? Because he was always agitated, aroused, what I now understand as perceiving threat. So he is in this hammock swing, but there's an opening and he's making eye contact with me. And anytime eye contact breaks, he starts screaming, okay? So we spend the entire first hour him just being in this hammock swing and her pushing it back and forth and asking him, like, do you want it faster? Do you want it slower? Maybe we can count to 100. But he seemed to want to be in that hammock swing. And there were two things that I was thinking about at this time. First of all, I was like not understanding what the hell was going on with my son. I was like, why does he only want to be in this hammock swing? Why is he screaming every time he's breaking eye contact? When she slows down, he's saying more, more. And I, from a traditional parenting lens, am worried about like he's being rude. She must be bored just swinging him back and forth. Is this even therapy? What are we doing? Right? And when he would say more, 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 it would be in like an aggravated, agitated tone. And at that point, I was still correcting that of like, you don't speak to the therapist like that. And she gently corrected me like, it's okay. Like, it's okay. He can express however he wants. It gives me information about what his body needs. So that was like a first, like, whoa, okay, this is a different space. And then the second point was when I was trying to make him put his shoes on because it was time to put his shoes on at the end of the session. And I was like, Cooper, put on your shoes. And he was refusing. And she's like, we can just put his shoes on for him. It's okay. Like he just had a big first session. And I'm thinking to myself, what do you mean a first session? He was just like in a hammock swing for an hour. Okay. So that was my very, very first day of occupational therapy with my son. And at this point, we were planning and did go 5 days a week. Okay. But the second thing I was thinking was, I cannot believe that this is my life now, that this is what I'm going to be doing with my time, that I'm a full-time caregiver at home with this kid who won't speak to me, growls at me, says stop talking, and like sort of swings between totally being shut down and just eating crunchy snacks and saying his legs don't work to like screaming, aggression, and meltdowns. But the OT, the occupational therapy, provided this bright spot because it was someone else who knew more than me about what was going on, who was confident that we were going to make some progress, and I was completely learning something new. But I felt this immense loss of like, holy shit, like this is like really my only structure with this kid for the foreseeable future. And I don't know what's going to happen, right? And we had made the decision when I left my career to move back to my home state of Michigan because we couldn't afford to live in Washington, D.C. if both of us didn't have full-time jobs. Okay, so during this time, I was speaking to my therapist on my lunch hour, like leading up to this point, and I was having such a hard time taking the leap to leave my career, to move to Michigan, and I just kept saying, yeah, these things are really painful, but I know what they are, right? Like I have a grasp of trying to go to work and then coming home and having these meltdowns. I have a grasp of who my friends are in Washington, D.C. I have a grasp on what this even looks like. And she would remind me, even things that aren't right for you can feel certain and you get attached to them because you know what they are. It's like the known versus the unknown, which would be moving to Michigan. You don't know if you're going to make friends. You don't know if you're going to find another occupational therapist. You don't know what your house is going to look like. You don't know if you're ever going to find another job. And so it was this great uncertainty and loss that I was experiencing. And 5.5 years later, which was this week, I just experienced another loss, and I want to tell you what it is. So I had a conversation with my son, my PDA son's lovely, wonderful occupational therapist here in Michigan. And she shared the conversation that we've been having for a while, which is, I think Cooper's ready to graduate from occupational therapy. It is no longer medically necessary for feeding, self-regulation, gross motor integration. So we will be actually graduating him over the next 2 months. But what did I feel in that moment when she talked to me about it? I felt a familiar yet surprising sense of loss. Why? Because I had changed so much between 5.5 years ago when I had walked into that occupational therapy space and watched my son in a hammock swing and tried to make him put his shoes on, to where I am now talking to his therapist and thinking, wait, I don't want to change this. I like going to therapy with him. I like having this hour-long space that we have together now that we're down to one session, where I love the occupational therapist. It's a safe space. We get a break from school and we get to connect. So, I was very surprised at that feeling because I reflected back 5.5 years ago on my feeling of loss then, which was like, I can't believe I have to do this. I can't believe that I have to just come to occupational therapy all the time. And so I wanted to share with you the in-between of those 5.5 years and sort of what helped me navigate that loss initially and kept me sane during those years, and what I'm going to be trying to bring into this next era or phase of my PDA son's life now that he's 10 and won't be going to occupational therapy with me and his dad every single week. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that when I was navigating the loss of my identity as an academic and professional woman in DC who wore suits and like, you know, wore her pearls and her high heels and makeup and all the things, and had like a corner office with glass walls right next to the VP overlooking the portrait gallery in downtown DC. You know, I was showing up at these occupational therapy sessions demolished. Like, I was so confused. I was so sad. I would wear sweatpants, no makeup. Like, I could barely get out of bed trying to do this. But one of the things that started to save me in this moment of loss and transition was having a curiosity mindset. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that I started to find intellectual interest and true openness and curiosity around sensory differences, occupational therapy, and this profession that I had no idea even existed. Okay, like all the professional colleagues that I had like work in very like academic-y things, right? Not like swinging in a hammock swing and, you know, going on swings and tumbling and crash pads and getting that proprioceptive input. So I started to either naturally or by, not by force, but just by necessity, start to find some interest in what is it that this profession is doing, and what is this sensory system, and how does it work? And, you know, how, like, what do the therapists learn in occupational therapy school? Like, even watching them change the carabiners to put up the hammock swings, I just found like such an interest in like, do you learn that in your master's degree? Do you have workshops where you like practice putting up carabiners safely and like doing it quickly? Do you ever pinch your fingers in it? You know, what brought you to this profession? Obviously, I didn't have a lot of time in the sessions, because if I spoke to my therapist in the first couple years, my son would get activated, which I'm sure you guys understand. But I started to develop a real curiosity about occupational therapy and the sensory system, and also about my son, right? And so for me, because I'm somewhat of a cerebral person, which you may or may not have noticed, I had to make it intellectually interesting to myself to be a full-time caregiver. And so occupational therapy was a space where I was really learning him, and I was really learning about neurodivergence, right? And so it became an opportunity for me to observe, with the help of an occupational therapist, like every eye twitch, every pupil dilation, every response to every strew or offer, every tone, every time he would drop a food and then try a new one, when we would be bridging from like Lay's potato chips to, you know, wavy potato chips. Why was he able to bridge, but then why did he drop the Lay's potato chips? So inside my head during every single one of these sessions, I was observing every mechanism and every response so that I could actually understand him, okay? So my brain was constantly going as I was in these sessions, right? And so for me, it became, on a very small level, growth, right? Like intellectual growth, but also in my ability to understand my son. The next thing was relationships, right? Like I never would have met the people that I've met in the occupational therapy space, some of whom I have become friends with and learned from and collaborated with and even done courses with, without having that opportunity to be in their space consistently and having an hour where maybe I'm going through the obstacle course, where, you know, my son is again in the hammock swing directing us, me and the occupational therapist, to play a game against each other so that he can be above us and sort of equalize and come back to nervous system safety. So the new relationship was also very meaningful for me in the space of leaving behind my colleagues from Washington, D.C. and the community of people I had there, which was also intersecting with the time of the pandemic. So the third thing that I learned through navigating this loss of my previous identity and the uncertainty in which we moved into this period of time of full-time caregiving, and really the only structure was occupational therapy, was a lot more compassion and tools for relating to other humans that had nothing to do with PDA. Okay, so understanding the sensory system of like, it's okay if like I have sensory reactions or don't like certain foods. I don't need to people please if I'm having a sensory reaction. Understanding my other son, who's now 6, who has sensory issues as well, but also just other humans, right? Where it can even be a topic of conversation of like, if I'm doing a live with people, like talking to them about the sensory experience, or if I'm in a program of like, movement is okay when we're on the Zoom calls, like, we're going to have captions, all that stuff, like learning how to be more compassionate through the sensory and neurodivergent lens. Okay, so these 3 lessons on a very small scale, but a very personal scale, which I think many of us here in this community as parents go through this grief and loss, not over our child, because our child is our child and has always been the same. We're just learning how to see them, but rather loss of like truly letting go of what we thought our life was going to look like, how we were going to spend our time, our intellect, our contributions, right? Especially if you're a career-oriented person like I was. So as I said, the 3 things that we can apply are curiosity, mindset, and openness to learning, which is essentially a growth mindset. Understanding that new relationships can flourish in the space that we open up when we, move on to the next phase. And then compassion / tools for understanding others. So I think those are generalizable lessons to loss on a micro scale, but also on a larger scale. So I wanted to share that story with you because I am feeling a little sentimental, even though it's like such good news and like such a testament to how far my son has come with his gross motor planning, with his feeding, with everything. But it's also a loss because it's the end of an era for our family. And what we're doing now at this stage in this transition, we'll have about 2 months to transition, is making plans with him for feeding, for what he wants to be working on to get more protein, because he plays tackle and flag football, and the goals he has moving forward. And then we're going to be talking to him about like, okay, how can we replace some of this in different ways? Like, do you want to do talk therapy? Do you want to do craniosacral therapy? Do you just need to come home from school still early on Mondays and have some one-on-one time with mom or dad? Because that was part of the equation. So we're now that he operates mostly from that thinking brain, that frontal lobe is not in burnout, and we have this totally shifted relationship, we can leverage things like collaborative problem solving by Dr. Ross Greene and actually make a plan for getting his needs met, even if it doesn't look like the occupational therapy and the same therapist that we've had now for over 5 years. So it's a scary thing when, you're moving into new phases, even if they're positive or good in the long term. But I wanted to share that with you because I know that 2 things are true. One, that, there's a lot of, in the neurodiversity space, people can get really triggered when we talk about grief or loss because it's especially people who grew up neurodivergent and didn't get their needs met or accommodations, can feel really triggered about like you are grieving who this person is. But I don't think that's what I'm trying to get across. I hope I'm communicating it clearly, which is like, we can totally radically accept the child. And in fact, it's when we do radically accept the child that the grief and loss comes, because it means having to change a lot about our lives day to day and in the future that we didn't expect to have to change, right? If you're not accommodating, advocating for, making decisions for your neurodivergent child, there isn't actually that loss. Okay, so true acceptance is shifting your behavior. Yeah, change is extraordinarily difficult, especially if you're someone like me who likes things to stay the same. If you are an anxious person, if you're autistic yourself, like all of these things can make it harder to navigate that shift, that change, that uncertainty, and that loss of like what was to what might be, because we don't know what might be. But if we can bring that curiosity mindset, the openness to new relationships, and learning more compassion and tools for not just parenting, but other areas of your life, it can really feel like a gain as you navigate that shift. So I hope that was supportive of you. We have a team meeting for At Peace Parents at 10, and then I have a research meeting with the PDA Society soon after. So I'm going to jump off, but it was nice to see everyone, and I hope you guys have a good Thursday.